Awesome. We're going to talk about global risk analysis. We're going to begin by talking about specifically geopolitical risk. Geopolitical risk describes the probability that a proposed goal, an economic project, or a diplomatic experiment will suffer due to circumstances related to unexpected changes involving political revolutions, coups, elections, ethnic conflicts, disputes in the arena, national or international policy, property rights, and a number of similar events that relate to the forces of geopolitics. So in analyzing global risk, what we're really doing is trying to come up with an understanding of the forces that geopolitics play that might pose that might pose risks that are severe to things. This is relevant to debate for a lot of reasons. Oftentimes when we engage in weighing conversations, specifically on foreign policy motions, we're inadvertently doing this kind of geopolitical risk analysis that's common for diplomats, investors, and the like. There's three very broad categories of geopolitical risk that I want us to familiarize ourselves with as we move through this conversation. The first is an economic category of geopolitical risk. The second is what we would call a diplomatic category, and the final one is domestic. Economic geopolitical risk relates primarily to investors. These are individuals who are trying or looking to make large investments in areas, either through foreign direct investment by pouring some of their own money into a different country and market, or in their own market. It has to do with how much risk they're taking on in their investment, specifically as it relates to geopolitics. For example, if I'm a large investor, either a person, a corporation, or a nation, and I want to invest in Saudi Arabian oil, the current humanitarian crisis going on in Yemen might be an example of an economic geopolitical risk that I'll have to deal with. If I am a diplomat or a nation that's trying to engage in peace talks with other nations, there are similarly geopolitical risks that are unanticipated that might put my project of peace or cooperation at stake. And finally, there's domestic risk. This is risk that populations face when making decisions as populations. So economic risk is faced by entrepreneurs, market participants, and central bank officials, just to name a few. These individuals view geopolitical risk as key determinants of investment decision and of stock market dynamics. In a Gallup 2017 survey of more than 1,000 investors, 75% of respondents expressed worries about the economic impacts of the various military and diplomatic conflicts happening around the world, ranking geopolitical risk ahead of both political and economic uncertainty. The second kind of risk that we can talk about broadly is diplomatic risk. These are external events that risk the diplomatic success of a seemingly unconnected goal. For example, North Korean aggression can sometimes undermine Chinese diplomacy in the region. If the United States is headed to China, and on that very same day North Korea tests a nuclear weapon, it might hint that the region itself is volatile and subject to different kinds of conflicts and tension, even though North Korean aggression has nothing directly to do with, just for example, say a US-China trade deal. That kind of action, just because of its regional proximity, or even because of China and North Korea's cooperation or ideological proximity, can pose a diplomatic risk, both to Chinese diplomacy and to US interests in the region. It's important to note that diplomatic risk refers to unrelated or seemingly external events that impact the kind of connections that countries have with each other. There's also policy risk, or what we would call population risk. This is also known as policy uncertainty risk. It's the rate at which nations' policies are subject to things like election capture and partisanship. Does anybody know what I mean by election capture?
No.
Hannah, do you have a guess?
Is it like interference or something like that?
Not interference. So that's also definitely an area of policy risk, or definitely an area of diplomatic risk that we're going to talk about later. Election capture is whenever policies are subject to the capture of an election cycle, such that we can expect them to swing or change as a major part of the election cycle. The U.S. has a few domestic examples. For example, if you are uninsured and require on healthcare that does not come from your employer, or believe that healthcare is a right that should not come from your employer. In the US, things like affordable healthcare are often subject to election capture. The Obama administration might pass the Affordable Care Act, which ensures several hundreds of thousands of individuals. And then at the next election, knowing the different Democrats and Republicans that are available to choose from, populations might face policy uncertainty risk, because policies like healthcare are subject to election capture because of partisanship, such that if Trump won the election, then individuals may lose their healthcare. Or if someone else won the election, they might have expanded healthcare. Policy uncertainty risk points to partisanship, or how likely it is for a policy to be changed based off of 4-year, 7-year, 6-year, 8-year election cycles that the executive or congressional branches have based on the country that we're operating in. It also refers to the level of confidence in public voting schemas. So if I'm an investor and I'm looking to invest in Britain, and it's a few months out before the Brexit election, I may look at polling and say, I'm going to hold off on investing several millions or several thousands of dollars in these firms in the United Kingdom, because I'm noticing that there's a level of confidence in public voting schemas that I'm lacking. Because it seems that individuals may legitimately try and leave the European Union, and so I'm going to wait to see what happens. Because if individuals do leave the European Union, that's a policy uncertainty risk for a few reasons, because I have to make trade-offs about the value of return that I'm going to get on my investment in that nation if I'm uncertain about the future of that nation's cooperation with the economic exchange of the European Union. This is a very real example. In 2016, when investors were deciding whether or not to follow London and to have investment firms enter there, it was a really big deal. Practically because London was the world's second largest international finance hub. Having connections to the European Union was a really big deal for Britain, the UK, and in particular, finance firms in London. If I'm an investor or a company that's trying to engage in business that relies on Britain having open trade, open borders, and easy access to multiple European markets, I'm going to face a level of policy risk because of my lack of confidence in public voting schemas. Obviously, now we know that Britain did choose in the referendum to leave the European Union, and they're going through that transition as we speak. These are trade-offs and uncertainties that voters, investors, or relocators have to face about their personal votes or the votes of the populations and investments as they might contribute to policy. Any questions so far on these broad categories of geopolitical risk before we continue on for the rest of the lecture? You're more than welcome and encouraged to ask questions, especially to help you with your notes. Awesome. If there are no questions, I'll keep going. Feel free at any moment to just chime in and ask for a clarification or a question or incorporate an example. So now we're going to talk about the J-curve. The J-curve is a phenomenon that was created as a concept by the political scientist whose name is Ian Bremmer, Ian Bremer, Ian Bremmer. He is the president of the Eurasia Group. They are a geopolitical risk think tank and firm that works to analyze levels of geopolitical risk across countries for investors, for companies, and for diplomatic individuals. The J-curve refers specifically to the levels of stability and openness or freedom that a nation might have, and the kind of relationship you can expect to have between those two. So as a nation has increased levels of stability, it also tends to have increased levels of openness or freedom. But we can note that the J-curve is interesting in particular because a nation can move anywhere on the curve. Initially, nations with high levels of stability but low levels of openness may not see high levels of economic activity. Interesting examples of nations that might have high levels of stability and high levels of economic openness might be nations like China or Saudi Arabia. Because Saudi Arabia is ruled by the House of Saud, a single family, it tends to maintain a decently high level of stability. The country is not subject to turmoil, revolutions. Market investors don't have to worry about, will the House of Saud be overthrown? Who will be in power? Because a single family and their interests tend to rule Saudi Arabia, we know what those interests are, and the levels of stability tend to be high. Similarly, Saudi Arabia is very willing to engage in open markets with other nations to sell, buy, and trade goods and oil. So Saudi Arabia has a high relationship on the J curve, where we can note their stability change over time. The J-curve can also relate to a nation's progress over time. As stability and openness fall, so do things like economic production, but a nation can move anywhere on the J-curve. It's important to note that both of these factors tend to be very important for what we call foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment is how a country can experience investments from sources outside of that country. A great example is to look at developing nations in the global south, particularly right now on the continent of Africa. Some examples might be like Rwanda and Zimbabwe, which have seen high levels of foreign direct investment from China. Rwanda is an interesting example because as Mugabe, the president of Rwanda, has created more stability and led to more openness, you see an increase in foreign direct investment because individuals have a perception that they face less risk if a nation is stable and if a nation is open. But as stability and openness drop, you can expect similarly the levels of economic investment to drop because individuals, investors, nations, diplomats, etc., are going to have the idea that in that market, at the very least, they face higher levels of risk or higher levels of cooperation based off of where you fall on that J curve. You can do more of your own independent research on the J curve because it's a very interesting and I think a very interesting phenomenon and concept that has a lot of utility. It's particularly relevant for talking about authoritarian regimes and developing nations. These two groups for a couple of reasons. One, because the rise and stability of authoritarian regimes in the geopolitical world is intriguing and striking for investors and for Western liberal democracies. The fact that China, as an authoritarian regime, has been able to maintain high levels of stability and high levels of economic openness challenges many of the economic models proffered forward by Western liberal democracies. In many ways, nations like China and Saudi Arabia are doing much better economically because they're able to weather many storms. A good example, I think, is something like the coronavirus. The ability of nations that have high levels of authoritarianism or just high levels of stability in general, regardless of their form of governance, are able to maintain high levels of economic output because countries are confident in those kinds of markets. Developing nations are also very relevant to the J curve because developing nations have to make active decisions in their history and progression about the levels of openness they're comfortable with. If a developing nation has too high a level of economic openness, this can look like things like low factory standards, a lack of environmental regulations, low tariffs, high free trade. These kinds of things would encourage markets to flock to that nation and its resources. That can lead to things like neo-colonialism, where nations that don't yet have a good enough stability can't reap those economic benefits for themselves, but only find themselves subject to the kind of activity that would lead to their markets being taken advantage of, as opposed to being helped. Awesome. It looks like somebody has just joined our session. So if you've just joined, this elective is recorded. So anything that you've missed, you have the ability to go back and catch up on. Right now, we're talking about the J curve, a phenomenon created by the political scientist Ian Bremmer in his 2008 book, The J Curve, Why Nations Fall and Rise. This explains the relationship between nations' levels of stability and economic openness. Stability and economic openness are both relevant for investors and diplomats because they expose, at least most intuitively, the kind of risk that we can expect. Now we're going to talk about state capitalism. State capitalism is a fairly recent phenomenon, and it's kind of a contradiction in terms of the way the words are set together. It's an oxymoron in several ways, at least how we typically envision capitalist systems, capitalist economies, or markets function. In a traditional paradigm, capitalism is typically aligned with what we would call laissez-faire economics, or the idea that markets ought to be left to their own volatility without relative interference from the state. That is to say that the market will solve itself, that if we allow the markets or capitalist systems to have low level of state intervention in the forms of low regulation, low tariffs on things like exports and import rules, different environmental standards and quality, that the market will have a higher ability of openness to operate, create more goods more effectively, more cheaply, and it relies principally on the state not having that kind of intervention, because the idea flows that if we allow private investors to work, we'll have more levels of competition between individuals and between firms. State capitalism is an entirely different model, and it's becoming more and more prominent. State capitalism is the phenomenon whereby nation states will use economic output for political purposes as opposed to solely economic purposes. There's a careful distinction here because oftentimes laissez-faire capitalist nations don't have direct control over the economic outcomes of their markets. Typically because the level of stability in democratic countries corresponds to the level of openness, and high levels of stability are perhaps like extra high levels of stability tend to be relatively discouraged or unpopular in democracies because they suggest things like stability of the executive. Because democracies tend to have so much turnover in politicians, in conversations and change of ideas, it might be stable in terms of safety, but unstable in terms of things like economic policy, because policies are constantly changing. In areas like China, Russia, and Brazil, policies don't change, and neither do economic leaders. Russia recently, if you've been keeping up with the news, Vladimir Putin, in the congressional convention that recently happened, paved the way for him to basically serve without term limits. I think that Vladimir Putin has been in power, at least as the president, if not as like other executive officials of Russia, for over 14 years. Having one kind of economic policy in Russia for 14 years leads to a different kind of economic stability. Similarly, China has a one-party system where Xi Jinping will likely lead until he is incapacitated to do so, or is confident in a loyal successor that can take over the future of the Chinese Communist Party. This map shows as of June 2000, this graph shows as of June 2011, the share of national or state-controlled companies and capitalization on national stock market indexes. So we can see Walmart, Royal Dutch Shell, ExxonMobil, BP, Toyota, and Chevron. These are biggest globally listed companies by their revenue in 2010 in terms of billion. These companies are private firms. They're subject to the regulation of the state, but work best when the state doesn't regulate them. And they they compete with each other. Walmart is going to be competing with its competitors like Alibaba, Amazon, Target, Royal Dutch, ExxonMobil, BP, and Chevron are all going to be competing with each other. And that kind of competition allows the revenue to be divided up between individuals, ostensibly flow back down to populations, and ensure that better products and innovations are happening all the time. The alternative model of state capitalism, which we see happening with the Chinese National Petroleum Company, State Grid, Japan Post Holdings, and the Sinopec Group, are examples of Russia, Chinese, and Brazil having economic outcomes that go directly back towards the nation state. In other words, the relationship between GDP and other nations that host Walmart, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, Toyota, Chevron, is distinct from the relationship of GDP for nations that have Sinopec, China National Petroleum Corporation, State Grid, and Japan Post Holdings, because the flow of capital goes directly towards the state in forms of state capitalism. If we see that 80% of national state-controlled capitalization of the stock market indexes for China is how they get their money, that's companies that other markets are interacting with, but it's going directly towards China. What's interesting about state capitalism is that it impacts not the economic output of the nation per se, but rather the political output of the nation. Note that Walmart's performance, Royal Dutch's performance, ExxonMobil's performance, BP, Toyota, Chevron, etc., that kind of economic performance does not necessarily or directly relate to the political capital and power that Western liberal democracies maintain. What do I mean by that? So if Target were to go bankrupt, the United States would not suffer in terms of political power. It would not change our ability to act on the geopolitical stage as a seemingly world power. But if the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation were to go under, it would impact China's political outcomes and abilities. This means that state capitalism often has these companies creating revenue for the purposes of public spending expenditures or public spending projects. Anything from militarization to creating housing for your population to advancing medicine, anything that's state controlled. So that if Walmart creates record producing profits that year, it does inadvertently help and benefit the US economy and perhaps our political standing, but we can't use Walmart's $422 billion in profits to directly spend that money on things like bombs or housing or Medicare. Awesome. Another interesting phenomenon to note with state capitalism is its relationship to a phenomenon that geopolitical analysts have called rent-seeking states. You can do some more independent research on this phenomenon if you want, but rent-seeking states are nations that don't seek to necessarily increase or create new wealth. They are interested in expanding their share of pre-existing wealth in the global market. This is most common, I think, with nations like Russia. Russia, by and large, doesn't tend to be interested in the creation of capital. That is to say, in encouraging private firms to come up with innovation, to create capital that will flow to other individuals. They seem interested in capturing pre-existing wealth in the form of rent seeking. Awesome. Aside from state capitalism, even though there's not a picture or a slide here, I want to talk about a separate and distinct model of economic outputs that some nations rely on, and it's known as the rentier model. Rent-seeking and rentier states are distinct. Rentier for a rentier state. A great example of a rentier state is Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman, a lot of the nations that find themselves in the Gulf Coast and are members of OPEC, or oil-producing exporting countries, OPEC. A rentier state primarily relies on its exportation of a single product. So Yemen, for example, or Oman or Saudi Arabia gets the majority of their wealth from selling oil. I'd be willing to bet that something like 60 to 70% of Saudi Arabia's annual wealth is generated just by other nations and companies buying the oil they have to offer the global market. But I think that what's really interesting is rentier states are in a tough position, especially as it relates to the J-curve. Because the level of stability that rentier states can operate depends on the viability of their primary exporting product. So in the case of Saudi Arabia, let's look at Saudi Arabia in depth. Saudi Arabia is an authoritarian regime. There's low levels of individual and civil freedom, but high levels of market freedom in the sense that individuals can actively cooperate and trade with Saudi Arabia in the form of collaboration with other nations. But stability is interesting in Saudi Arabia right now. Anybody that knows about Saudi history knows that protests are not uncommon, but are easily dealt with. If you live in Saudi Arabia, and let's say that in 2016, you want to protest for the right for women to drive, a law that wouldn't be codified and passed until 2017 and 2018 in Saudi Arabia. Saudi citizens will do things like rise up and protest, and because the House of Saud, one single family, controls the entirety of the nation's wealth, they'll simply increase public spending. They'll do things like increase healthcare, increase entitlements, increase access to food, and basically just have a big cash dump fall down in this form of a lump sum or a single payment of some sort on the population. That increases the stability of the nation because the participants that were protesting, the civilians, calm down, they had their needs met of some level, and it's okay. Saudi Arabia can do that because the primary focus of their income as a nation or wealth creation comes from exporting a single product, oil, that makes them a rentier state. But this is interesting for Saudi Arabia. As oil becomes less and less of a favorable product on the global sphere because of things like climate change and proxy wars, Saudi Arabia is losing its primary source of income. Rentier states are, again, those states that have one primary source of income that comes from an exporting product. That could be coffee, if perhaps a nation is producing primarily coffee. But the major examples of rentier states that are able to have mass amounts of national wealth so far have been those OPEC countries, oil-producing, exporting countries, who are going to, in the very near future, 5 to 15 years, have to figure out a fundamentally different economic output for their countries to maintain both stability and market openness if that single product like oil is not going to be purchased in the future at the same kind of levels. Awesome. Now we're going to talk about the concept of a G0 world. Do we have global leadership? First, I want to garner your take on this question. Do we have global leadership? Maddie, what do you think? Does the world have identifiable global leadership?
I'm a little confused by what you mean by global leadership.
Well, what do you think I mean?
Again, it depends what part of the world you're talking about. I suppose in the West.
The entirety of the world. Global. Is there a global leadership? A place that we could all kind of, as different nations, turn to for authoritative leadership. And it's okay if the answer is yes or no. I'm just curious what your immediate intuition is.
No.
No. What do you think, Hannah? Do we have global leadership?
I think we definitely do. I mean, like, we have bodies like the UN, and when certain countries are facing various issues or they want to solve conflicts between them diplomatically, like, they might look towards routes like that. But I think there's also a level of like unofficial global leadership that like superpowers like the United States have, in which they wield a lot of influence over the actions of other countries, and like a lot of other countries follow our lead in what we choose to do regarding policies, and like the, you know, even just like the way that we treat our citizens. And so even though it's not like a big organization that everybody just agreed to be part of, they definitely do lead, as well as other countries like China.
Awesome. That's a good answer. Jeanette, what do you think? What is your intuition? Do you think we have global leadership, or would you disagree with Hannah?
I agree with Hannah that I don't know if there's exactly an organization that has like every country in the world a part of it, but I heard this thing about like the Big Five or something, where it's like the 5 superpowers kind of have control over these smaller countries and like what their like actions and stuff are.
Definitely. The Big Five refers to the nations that have veto power on the UN Security Council, for those of you who are unfamiliar with that phrase. What do you think, Sonika? Do you agree that we have global leadership, or do you think that we lack a kind of global leadership?
I think to some extent we do. Like, the UN does play a role in like helping countries out and stuff, like UNICEF and stuff like that. But I do think we lack a global leadership because a lot of the time, the big superpowers, all they do is they only help other countries if they have a benefit, if they're like getting oil from that country or something like that. So I think we lack a global leadership.
Interesting. That's good. Sherry, what do you have to contribute? What do you make of this question? Intuitively, does it feel that we have global leadership, or would you err on the side of a lack of global leadership?
I agree with Sonika. I think that we do have some control, but for the most part, we lack like an overarching like force.
This is all very interesting. I think that you're all correct, and you're all also wrong in some sense. I think that global leadership is something that in a concrete sense, in a sense that would be comfortable, we lack. I think that there's been times when we've had strong global leadership. I think that when I refer to global leadership, to get back to Maddie's question, what are we referring to? I think that we're referring to the ability of nations to have a kind of role model or influencing force that can direct the tides of geopolitics such that they are subject to less uncertainty and less risk. I think that Hannah referred to different times and processes where the US has had high amounts of influence, and that's definitely changed across time. There's been different camps of global leadership. So now we're going to talk more specifically about global leadership and talk about this concept of G0. G0 is a concept in risk analysis that refers to the lack of global leadership. A G0 world is a world where there are multiple major superpowers, none of which, though, are playing a leading role and commanding a majority of the other nations. Instead, it looks like a system of multipolarity. So we might be familiar with a system of bipolarity. This was very common in the Cold War and might have even been common prior to something like Obama's 2008 pivot to Asia, or may even be common at the beginning of the Trump-China trade war. Bipolarity refers to the phenomena whereby two countries maintain a rough stability that's generated through the risk of conflict between those major world powers. This is exemplified through the Cold War. The Cold War was a time of strenuous peace because of the risk of major conflict between two bipolar or bipolarities. Multipolarity refers to the management of peace that arises through nothing more than the risk of unbridled chaos. It's kind of scary, but the idea that the US, without the collaboration of Europe, might engage with Russia, who would engage independently with China, who now might engage with the India, Pakistan own individual powers, who have their own relationship with Brazil, who is a burgeoning power. All of these things refer to multipolarity, or peace being maintained through the process of its constant risk of falling apart. G0 refers to the lack of countries to unify together. So we're sometimes familiar with like the G7 summit or the G20 summit or the G5 summit. To 20 of the world's biggest global superpowers in terms of economic output, military strength, scientific and technological advancements, and progressions in social treatment and human rights. So the G7 countries theoretically make up the 7 countries that excel best at that. We can find a list. I'm not confident, I'm going to be totally transparent, of my ability to name accurately all G7 countries, but I believe that the US, Canada, France, the UK, Germany, I think Brazil may or may not be a member of the G7, and India may or may not be a member of the G7. And they change at times. We change who has membership to G7 forums and summits. We change who has access to these kinds of conversations. Similar references to this kind of this kind of global power, is the World Economic Forum at Davos that we had this year, where different members of nations can come together to talk and collaborate. G20 summits, same thing, from G7 but to G20, it just gets larger. And these summits, historically, from things like Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points Agreements that helped to establish the League of Nations and then the United Nations, are supposed to be moments of collaboration that look for global leadership. In the past, it's not uncommon for 1 or 2 members of the G7 summit to author in their entirety things like the Paris Climate Agreement Accords that nations sign on to. And the process of using soft power as opposed to hard power, do we know those distinctions? Hard power is when you use things like threats of military force to get nations to cooperate with you. Soft power is whenever you use things like economic incentives and diplomatic ties to encourage nations to cooperate with you. And then smart power is a combination of hard and soft power employed normally in the form of economic statecraft. Soft power, hard power, smart power. G7 summits normally had a combination or an employment of that kind of smart power, where a nation would author some kind of treaty, some kind of forum, perhaps the Kyoto Protocols, the early 1970s and 1980s economic protocols about the environment, and then using that influence to get nations to agree. What's really interesting and noteworthy is the US has pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreements. As the nation that wrote them, the US has pulled out of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan for Nuclear Weapons, that aka the Iran deal. The US has pulled out of the Iran deal. The US established NATO, and we basically bullied a bunch of other Eastern European countries into joining and giving us money for NATO and allowing us to put tanks to do things like stop Russian aggression. And the US now has vocalized that we might disband or leave NATO. Similarly, we poured funding for tons of international projects and organizations that we founded. This refers to the creation of a kind of G0 phenomenon, whereby countries resort more to protectionism and nationalism as opposed to collaboration and integrationism. Brexit can also be seen as part of this G0 phenomenon, whereby the UK is pulling out of a system that they had a large hand in creating, especially in the last few years of the European economic exchange market. The G0 phenomenon can also refer to the coronavirus pandemic, COVID-19, and the difficulty that we're having navigating it as a global nation. With China first lying to the global community about the extent and time frame of the outbreak, as well as a lack of a global vaccine response, is evidence of a G0 world. Right now, there are 4 distinct pockets of nations that are racing to create their own vaccine. And it's similar to something like a space race, where nations are trying to create it before other nations do, knowing that eventually other nations will, but trying to get there first for some kind of advantage. It's very feasible and very likely and not outlandish that perhaps as early as 7 years ago, the world could have been cooperating with 2 camps or a single camp to create one vaccine, as opposed to nations competing to create vaccines for the coronavirus. That refers to the lack of global leadership that the world faces. So now I want you to go to https://tinyurl.com/GDS-risk. And I'm going to give you a couple moments to do that. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to go access this document, also get some water and stretch. It is currently 12:13, 12:14 Central Time. So in 3 to 4 or 5 minutes, we're going to come back and continue this lecture. I just want to give you time to access this document, make sure you have it pulled up. Don't peruse through it yet. We'll go through it together. And then get some water and stretch and take a moment, maybe even formulate some questions if you have some. So 2 to 3 to 5 minutes. I'll be back in probably 3. Awesome. I'm back, and I believe that I have the document pulled up. And if everybody else has the document pulled up, and if y'all are all ready, then we can begin. I see it. One thumbs up from Maddie. Awesome. Thumbs up from Janet. I'll give it just a couple more minutes. Awesome. I think everybody should be back. I think everybody's here. We're going to go ahead and go on. Everybody has this document, I'm assuming. We're going to go through it together, and I'll explain what it is. But first, okay, so the document that you should have at your disposal should look kind of like this. Maybe not. I'm having difficulty figuring out how to screen share. See, I'm going to stop sharing and then look for the document again.
I can share my screen if you need help.
I found it. I was just, I think, having difficulty looking for that tab because I had closed it, it looks like. But now I'm opening it back up.
Okay.
Okay. So our document should look like this. Is this correct? Everybody sees this document on your personal device? Great.
Yes.
So we're going to work through this document. This document is produced by the Eurasia Group. It's the same global risk analysis think tank and firm that we mentioned earlier. Ian Bremmer is the president of, and we're going to move through these risks together as Ian Bremmer analyzes them and how they might relate to the global stage alongside a video. So first we're going to watch the video. And this video was produced on January 2nd of 2020. And Ian Bremmer and the Eurasia Group, this global risk analysis geopolitics firm, predicts every year the top 10 risks that the world will face in geopolitics and why. We're going to move through his predictions as they looked like on January 2nd. The document that you have on your PDF will go through these transitions, but they will also be updated for how the coronavirus impacts these pre-existing geopolitical trends. So you can follow along on your PDF. It'll be really similar to how the video moves, just with COVID.
2020 is a tipping point. From China and the United States parting ways in the technology sphere, to social and political unrest in Latin America and India, to the challenge of a potentially contested US presidential election, we see a mounting threat of global crisis. Eurasia Group has identified the top 10 risks of the year, the political, economic, and environmental factors impacting the world in ways we haven't seen for generations. President Erdogan is no stranger to controversy and confrontation. In 2020, he faces unprecedented problems, especially deteriorating relations with the US, that will lead his nation to new lows. His popularity is declining, and his weakness will cause him to lash out. All this comes as Turkey faces financial strain caused by sanctions, leading to more political and economic instability.
There's a lot of anger in Latin America these days. Slow growth, corruption, and low-quality public services have raised social tensions in a region where a new and vulnerable middle class has high expectations. Countries as different as Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, and Ecuador all face tough decisions as budget cuts and austerity measures could mean more protests and volatility in 2020.
US policy toward the major Shia-led nations in the Middle East is imploding. That creates significant risks for regional stability, including a lethal conflict with Iran, upward pressure on oil prices, an Iraqi state that is either in Iran's orbit or failing, and a Syria fused to Moscow and Tehran.
Efforts to reverse climate change are not working. Today, we are on pace for a 3.5 degrees Celsius warming. That's a looming disaster for the planet and for millions of people, but governments can't agree on how to share the burden of fixing the problem. In 2020, it will become harder for companies to meet public expectations that they get greener. Investors and NGOs will pile on the pressure for action. There's also a risk of good old-fashioned public unrest. And if a warming planet triggers a natural disaster that disrupts national politics and economies, things will only get hotter.
Washington and Beijing won't like it, but Europe will become more assertive in 2020. On regulation, the EU's top antitrust official is battling North American tech giants. When it comes to trade, look for the EU to get tougher on China and to advance its climate goals by setting new rules with the threat of tariffs to enforce them. We won't see a European army, but EU leaders will use the world's largest internal market to break down cross-border barriers to military trade.
India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has already spent much of his second term promoting controversial social policies. His government has revoked special status for Jammu and Kashmir, stripped nearly 2 million people of their citizenship, and advanced a plan to make religion a factor in whether migrants can live and work in India. In 2020, he'll up the ante further, even as protests and unrest grow. This agenda will harm India's foreign relations and further hurt already weakened economy.
Many believe multinational corporations can fill the gaps of global governance in a G0 world by stepping up to lead on climate change, poverty relief, and even trade. In fact, MNCs account for a quarter of worldwide employment, a third of global output, and more than half of global trade. But in 2020, governments will work to put a leash on many of these companies. Expect new data policies, higher taxes, new cyber standards, and more, creating a more challenging environment in the year ahead.
As the US and China go their separate ways in technology, we'll see a more explicit clash over national security, global influence, and values. The two sides will continue to use economic tools as their main weapons, things like sanctions, export controls, and boycotts, but they'll have shorter fuses and increasingly overt political goals. As tensions play out over trade policy, Taiwan, Hong Kong, human rights, and a host of other issues, other countries, as well as multinational businesses, will get caught in the crossfire.
The decision of the US and China to decouple in the technology sphere is the single most impactful trend for globalization since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The fissure is disrupting the flow of technology, talent, and investment between the two nations, and will expand beyond semiconductors, cloud computing, and 5G networks to impact media, entertainment, and academic research. As a virtual Berlin Wall goes up, which side will other countries choose?
In 2020, US political institutions will be tested in unprecedented ways. The nation faces the risk that the presidential election will be viewed as illegitimate no matter who wins. Democrats will accuse Republicans of placing President Trump above the law and of using his presidential power to investigate his rivals. What's more, Washington will do little to stop outside election interference, especially from Russia. The uncertainty surrounding the election will take the US into uncharted political waters and send shockwaves across the world.
Awesome. So what do we make of some of these top risks?
A lot of them are like chain events. Like one thing is just like sort of like dominoes, like one thing's going to lead to another, especially regarding US, China, and Russia, like seeing as those countries are all varying political tensions for different things. Like the technology divide between US and Russia is slowly going to sort of incentivize either country like going forward for trade, which also leads like to Chinese aggression in the South China Sea and the policies regarding like Hong Kong and Taiwan. And so all these countries are sort of getting caught up. Like they're not isolated events.
Definitely, they're not isolated events. And that kind of refers to that category of diplomatic risk, where actions that go on other places impact goals that seem seemingly unrelated. Yeah. What do we think? So this video was created to predict risks on January 2nd, 2020. I think that we kind of gone different directions. Some of them we're already seeing materialize. Anybody keeping up with like India and China knows that right now India and China are like basically at like war with each other all of a sudden as of a couple of weeks ago. Just not talking about it very loudly to the international community. All of those things are types of geopolitical risk. What else do we make of this video, or what intrigued us? What questions do we have?
A lot of it was like people not being happy with the government. They talked about that in like a lot of countries, Turkey, Latin America, a lot of it. It was just like a common theme that I noticed.
Yeah, civil unrest is a global phenomenon, and it always has been historically. When one country demonstrates, and this is only compounded because of things like international social media, when one country finds individuals that can demonstrate political fervor of that kind, then it, I think, empowers other individuals to also have that. Civil unrest, I think, is going to be huge in 2020. Huge. Like it's only been, I think, like what, 6 months of 2020, and the civil unrest in the US is already, I think, something that I would have never predicted on January 2nd, 2020. What else do we make of this video? Or do we have any questions about what we've seen in the lecture or in the content?
I had a question about number 8, the Shia crescendo. I was just wondering if you could provide some context, because I didn't really understand that one.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the Shia and Sunni divide in Islamic countries?
No.
That's definitely where we'll start. So this is a huge, I think, topic area that like people could like write entire dissertations on. And I'm not going to pretend to be the biggest expert, but you have in the camp of Islam as a religion, 2 distinct camps known as Sunni Muslims and Shia or Shiite Muslims. And Shia Muslim countries right now are Iraq and Iran, and it has to do with a couple of things. One is a theological divide that's native to the religion of Islam itself, that has to do with the genealogical interpretation of who is the actual heir of Muhammad the Prophet. The second has to do with the way that I think the government ought to function as it relates to the theology. So you'll notice that Iran and Iraq tend to be far more theocratic, imposing things like Sharia law as it relates to the Quran to individuals in those countries. And I think that Sunni Muslims don't kind of have that same theocratic drive to their nations. Right now, I think that the drive between Sunni and Shia Muslims has more to do with culture and historicity than it actually has to do with real theological conflicts about the interpretation of Islam as a religion. But that's just basically the divide between Sunni and Shia. That there's this divide between these larger 2 camps. The 2 Shia countries obviously are Iraq and Iran. Right now, Iraq and Iran are seeing less cooperation with the West. Traditionally, Sunni countries like Saudi Arabia have been willing to collaborate with the US, with the UK, with Britain and the West, especially in things like World War II, and have a long history of regional collaboration. But Shia countries have a different interpretation that relies on like the coming of the caliphate is what they might call it, that has to do with a war between the West and Islam as a religion. This is where a lot of the war on terror dialogues come. We collaborate with Sunni countries, we attack Shiite countries, that kind of thing. It's obviously a far more complex problem than that, but right now I think that those Shia countries, as outlined in the risk, are seeing high levels of tension with the West.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. So we're at about the 30-minute mark. I want to make sure that you'll have plenty of time to stretch, eat, get water, that kind of thing before you have to go to your electives at 1. So if there are no other questions, then I'm going to go ahead and dismiss everybody, and everybody is welcome to go. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I don't know if I've been keeping up or something, but what's going on between the US and China, like tech thing?
Yeah, so I think the PDF, you can read more on the PDF that I think would give you some detail about why it's significant, but technological developments are incredibly recent. If we think about like Alexa as like a form of AI, really only recent for consumer usage, like in the last 3 to 5 years, which means it only has existed in actual practice for something like 6 to 8 years. I think recency of that kind of technology is what's most relevant, because it concedes to us that technology is coming in the next 2 to 3 years that we can't even imagine. And technology currently exists right now that regular consumers don't but will soon have access to. Historically, the development of that kind of technology has had a high level of cooperation between Silicon Valley in the US and Eastern markets, primarily in Tokyo and Beijing. We see this all the time in Tokyo with things like Apple and the smartphone and smart cars, and in China with things like internet, 5G, cellular communication, and fiber optics. At the end of the day, here's what it's all about. These countries have long collaborated together in a form of international liberalism to advance technology, because that method just at the moment seemed faster and like it would benefit everybody. China recently made a national policy decision to kind of uncouple from the US and decide that as far as technology went, they were from this moment forward going to keep everything in-house. In other words, China was going to develop its own comparable version of US technology, not collaborate with US on the development of that technology, and sell its technology as an alternative to other nations. We're seeing this right now with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. If you are an African country or an Eastern European country or a South American country, you can ask China to come install 5G networks in your nation, and China will install their 5G networks in your nation. That might have security concerns for those nations because it might bolster Chinese power and information collecting. It's a security concern for the US, but it also means that now we're in a different kind of race. Similar and analogous to the space race, we're in a new kind of tech race where collaboration between the world's 2 main tech powers is no longer happening because China's made the decision to keep all of its tech advances in-house. We're also seeing increased levels of espionage, whereby Chinese individuals are sending people to US firms or stealing information to make that tech race happen faster. The tech race has a lot of implications. Some of them are military, right? Because technology has military applications. Some of them have to do with spying. Like if anybody has been keeping up with TikTok, you know that like TikTok's awesome. I love TikTok, don't get me wrong, but if you have the TikTok app, China knows exactly what you're doing on your phone. All of those things relate to the kind of technology race that we're gonna see taking off in the next 10 years.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Cool, so y'all can all go if there are no other questions, then you can all go. I'll stay and answer any questions you have. Feel free to keep the document that outlines the 10 risks. You can revisit them. This is a great way for us to be thinking about impact development and warranting. Global risk analysis for foreign policy motions is always how we get to our impacts. It's always how we do our warrant work. It's most similarly how we create our disadvantages.
Thank you.
Thank you, yeah.
Thank you.
So I had a few questions. One is, how is a rentier state like Russia, Iran, or Saudi Arabia, whose exports are like majority probably oil, different from like monostructured economies in the global south, like Malawi, which is like 70% tobacco, or Tonga, which is 50%, oil, but mostly
Yeah. I
non-profiting.
think the primary difference between rentier states and these kind of like mono economies that we're talking about probably has to do with I think the like substantial portion. So obviously they're very similar, right? These countries that like produce all of these single products are very similar to rentier states. But I think that rentier states probably are more characterized by the substantive amount of wealth that they're able to create for their economy. So like countries whose primary exporting is tobacco aren't going to see the kind of global power that I think that rentier states are capable of producing. But I think it would still be fair, like perhaps, to define these other states as rentier states. The idea for rentier states was created by an economist named David Ricardo, I believe, and it focuses on the model of rent, of kind of paying rent towards a nation because that nation is providing the globe or other individuals with that kind of profit. I think that monopolistic positions and monopolistic economies are definitely similar, and rentier states definitely adopt those kinds of models whenever they work internationally.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Then I just have one other question. How does like hot money FDI come into the J curve?
Like foreign direct investment, you mean?
Yeah, but more in terms of a sort of investment that would lead to more economic disaster in a country. Sorry, I know it's a really specific question because I come from PF when I'm not doing worlds.
I feel that. So I think that if there's an example, maybe that might be good here. I'm gonna do a little bit of research. Can you repeat your question one more time? Can we just so I have a better understanding of exactly what it is that you're looking for?
Sure. So my question is, how does hot money like come into the J curve, or how does it affect the J curve? And hot money, at least from what I understand, is like when a country with Venezuela, which has, almost unbelievable amounts of inflation, takes foreign direct investment, they often get vulture investment, which means like a lot of investors come in with high rates, but then because there's so many investors, the rates get driven down. Then the people in Venezuela can't really pay back those rates, so investors pull out and rates go back up. And then since the investors aren't making back that money from the Venezuelan people, they sort of move out into other areas of Latin America to try to make back that investment. But the investment rates just sort of either stay the same or get higher, and economic disaster spreads into other areas of Latin America.
Yeah, so I think what might be interesting is just to think about the J curve as impacting hot money as opposed to vice versa. Because like you're right that obviously these kinds of cash and capital flows, when they're like vulture, predatory, or pull out, they're subject to market volatility, can lead to instability. But the J curve is just trying to demonstrate that the relationship that stability and market openness has to how likely you are to get foreign direct investment in the first place. So I think that if Venezuela had high levels of market openness and relatively stable levels of market stability, they would see high levels of foreign direct investment. If we saw that kind of vulture phenomena whereby individuals pull out, then you decrease stability, but you maintain the market openness, and that's bad for the economy. You want an adequate level of both. For that kind of thing, I'm not entirely certain that I know a ton about that phenomenon, to be honest. So that I can do you more justice in my answer. But I would definitely pause it to you to do more research on Ian Bremer and some of his thoughts on the J curve as it pertains to developing nations in particular, because I know that he has a lot of that work out there that currently exists. His name is Ian Bremmer, even has a book on the J curve. If you're interested, I can probably find you free copies of the PDF chapters that might be most relevant to this question. But the J curve definitely, I think, just tries to demonstrate how nations can expect to receive things like foreign direct investment based on the relationship between their market openness and their economic stability.
Okay. Thank you. That makes sense. Yeah, because the two things I was wondering most with these questions is like, how does one country like Venezuela, whose main export is also oil, end up so much less successful, I think is an accurate analysis between Venezuela and like a country like Saudi Arabia.
Sure. I think that,
So,
to be
yeah.
quite honest, Venezuela's history has more to do with the Bretton Woods Forum in the 70s and the way that we change loans that developing nations can get from the IMF and from the World Bank than it does the country's own kind of experience with oil. I think Venezuela is an interesting case. I think that Chavismo or the relationship that the country's politics had to the Bretton Woods Agreement, to the IMF, is I think more what led to its current state of affairs. Because if you look at Venezuela, I think before the 70s, or at the beginning of the 70s, in the literature about global risk, individuals are predicting that Venezuela is going to become kind of a global South power. Obviously, that doesn't happen. I think that has less to do initially with failures on Venezuela's part and more to do with neocolonialism on the part of the IMF and the Bretton Woods Agreement.
And, how do you spell Bretton Woods Agreement?
BRE
Mm-hmm.
TTON. That's one name, Britain, and then the next is words, WOODS, Bretton Woods Agreement. It established what's known as the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus are the rules, basically, that countries have to play by in order to get bailout loans from the IMF or loans of any kind from the IMF.
Okay. Sorry, I know these are a lot of specific questions. I'll
That's
get out of
fine.
your hair. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.